Thank you for joining us for our DE&I seminar. I'm Kevin Jeffries, President and CEO of the Leawood Chamber of Commerce. I want to first of all give a special thank you to all of our annual sponsors who have helped make the programming for the Chamber this year possible, and last year and for many years. So we really appreciate all their support. Special thanks to Advent Health, Country Club Bank, Demdeco, Evergy, and Menorah Medical Center. And again, Advent Health, Country Club Bank, CrossFirst Bank, Demdeco, Evergy, and Menorah Medical Center. Also, a special thank you today to our sponsors for today's event. Our presenting sponsor is CrossFirst Bank, and our supporting sponsor is the Barstow School. Your contribution to this event is very much appreciated. Before we hear from Dr. Price, please welcome our presenting sponsor, Melissa Topham, Director of Client Services and President of CrossFirst Cares at CrossFirst Bank.
Good morning, and thank you, Kevin, for that introduction. CrossFirst Bank is currently the third largest bank headquartered in Kansas City and have our corporate office right here in beautiful Leawood, Kansas. Established in 2007, we have grown to over $6 billion in assets and have banks in Kansas, Missouri, Oklahoma, and Texas. As part of our strategic plan in 2020 and 2021, we created and formed CrossFirst Cares. This program represents the bank's initiatives and efforts in supporting the diverse thoughts, ideas, and perspectives of our employees and their well-being. Our IDEA Champions, which stands for Inclusion, Diversity, Equality, and Accountability, are a part of CrossFirst Cares as a voluntary group of employees that promote each of those pillars while supporting CrossFirst Bank's core values and our strength-based culture. Our mission statement is as follows: invest in the culture of our strengths to build connections and deepen relationships across the organization. We lead with positive intent and an open mind, respecting one another and appreciating our differences, inclusive of team members and our communities. I am proud to represent this group of volunteers and look forward to leading this initiative in the next several years for CrossFirst Bank. I encourage every organization to take a look at making this type of initiative within their own workplace. It will drive important discussions and will have a positive impact on those within your teams. Thank you again for attending this important event. And with that, I will turn it back over to Kevin to introduce our guest speaker.
Thank you very much. And again, thank you for your support. The members of the Chamber's Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Advisory Committee also deserve a big thank you for all their help at getting not only this event together, but for a series of events we have scheduled for the coming year. We look forward to working together and bringing our Chamber members and the community some great programming on this very important topic. I now have the pleasure of introducing our presenter for today's program. I had the good fortune of hearing Dr. Price speak about a month ago. As CEO of Lively Paradox, a training and development organization comprised of people who help your people get along, Dr. Nicole Price believes difference is strength and diversity is opportunity. Dr. Price is author of Lively Paradox, an authentic perspective of issues of diversity and inclusion. Her work includes leadership development, coaching, consulting, keynotes, which encourage and enable others to live their lives in excellence. Her energetic and engaging sessions leverage her real-world corporate experience as an engineer and manager and will leave you today with strategies and tools you can apply right away. She'll make you laugh, she'll make you think, and importantly, she'll make you better. Welcome, Dr. Price, and thank you for joining us today.
Good morning. You know, I am always still today very surprised when people think that they want to hear my perspective on this topic, because I'm not sure that I tell people a bunch of things that they don't know. In fact, I am pretty sure that I'm not going to tell you anything you don't know. So you might be asking, well, what are we here for? Well, my hope is that the more people I get a chance to talk to, my hope is that more people will think differently about what they already know. There's plenty of information, and there are many people who have opinions about diversity and inclusion. And my goal is just that those opinions would be informed opinions. So to help us get started, if you would please in the chat, if you would share, what is your definition of diversity? What's your definition of diversity? How do you define it? When you hear, or when you signed up today to go to a session about diversity and inclusion, what were you expecting that you would hear about? What were you expecting that you would hear about? I can see there's some people trying to respond. Scott, thank you. The differences we all possess. Dave says many kinds of ideas, people, and the ways in which they collaborate. Kay says continuing to learn how to honor what makes us different and what makes us the same. Thank you for that. Pedro, being able to have a clear relationship with myself and being able to communicate what my reality is. Being able to do so, let's see, allows me to see others for who they are. Okay. Communities that include a variety of perspectives on cultural important identity. Thank you for that, Sue. Kay says, I think diversity is all encompassing, who we are in every aspect. Michelle says different backgrounds and working together for one goal. Yeah, so you all understand what diversity is, and a few of you have shared what it means to also be inclusive. Now tell me, what do people typically think of when they hear the words diversity and inclusion? What do people typically think of? Thank you, Nikki. Race. Dave, race. Yes. Sometimes people will throw in sexual orientation and gender sometimes, but more often than not, when people hear the word diversity, they're thinking about racial differences, cultural differences, ethnic differences. You are absolutely right. And so I want to level set today and just share that what I am talking about is diversity and inclusion. Race and racial equity is a topic that I liken to calculus. And most US citizens have a pre-algebra level of understanding at best. There are things that we need to understand before many of us can get in a room together to talk about race. So I just want to be super clear that today, what we're talking about is difference in general, and we are not specifically talking about race and racial equity. Now, I want to give you some insight into my biases. I am an engineer by degree, and not just by degree. I worked in the field for over a decade. I absolutely value process improvement. It gives me life. However, my personality vehemently disagrees. And so about 10 years ago, I embarked on a different journey, and that journey was to help leaders figure out ways to be more effective with more people more often. But in that work, I discovered that there were people who thought that leadership was one thing over here on the left, and inclusion or diversity and inclusion was a completely different thing over here on the right. They did not see that their jobs as leaders was to be able to figure out how to help difference get along. And I tell you that because if you cannot figure out how to help difference get along, I argue that you're not a very effective leader at all. You see, if I can get a bunch of people who are just like me to work well together, to collaborate, to make progress on our goals, fabulous. But many of us have lots of difference on our teams, and that difference shows up in a variety of ways, and it can cause challenges if we are not equipped with tools, practices, and procedures that are well proven and documented to help us be better. And so I have a diagram that kind of helps people to understand kind of what this looks like and how do you progress as a leader. When you think about what happened in 2020, around April, May, and June, many people in the country were sparked into a level of awareness, not about difference necessarily, but about race. They were starting to see that we could no longer deny that we had differences based on the things that we could see, that were causing people to be treated in a variety of ways based on amount of melanin in skin and those lived experiences. And the dominant question I was getting right after the issues of Amy Cooper and Christian Cooper in the park in New York, or after Ahmaud Arbery was chased by citizens who deemed themselves to be authorities to, I don't know if they were planning to arrest him or what they were planning to do, but ultimately he ended up being dead. As we watched people share event after event on their cell phones, again, we were sparked into this area of awareness related to race. And the most common question I got was, okay, Nicole, so now what do we do about it? People wanted to jump from awareness to action. And I would tell them very clearly, you need to back up. This idea of, well, if we would just do X, or can you tell me what the 3 steps are so that I can fix this, is actually quite dangerous. And it is very clear to me when I get that question that people have no idea for how I don't want to say complicated, how entrenched some of the issues we have around difference are. So there are a few steps that I want to make sure we don't skip. One is to reflect on, how is it that we weren't aware? What were all the systems that were in place? What was shielding me from this knowledge before? Because there's a lot to be learned from that. And once I understand, okay, what has helped me not to be able to see what is happening here, then I can decide in my small corner of the world, what am I going to do in order to improve the situation? Once I make a strategic decision about that, and I use the word strategic purposefully, then I should take action and regularly check to see if my actions are helping or making the situation worse. And this process continues. It never ends. It is a continual process. There is no arriving. And when we leave our jobs, when we leave this earth, the hope is that we leave it just a little better than we came. But in the road to awareness, there's 2 typical ways that people get there. Both of those paths are equally destructive paths, actually. When individuals are in a space lacking awareness, they can be very destructive. And here's what I mean. Let's say that I got behind the wheel of an 18-wheeler and I decided that I was going to run into a crowd of people. And I was consciously making that decision. My intent was negative. If I roll over all the people in front of me, I am willfully destructive. I was conscious of my efforts and I knew exactly what I was doing. The outcome, though, was that people were either maimed or killed. But if I get behind the steering wheel of an 18-wheeler and I have no idea of the power of that vehicle, I don't know how to drive, and I start it up and begin moving, it is likely that I also can still run over a group of people, and my intent was good and well-meaning. I had no negative desires at all. However, the impact on the people at the other end of my actions is still destructive. And there's an adage that inside corporations all over this nation, people have adopted, and it is to assume positive intent. And while I vehemently agree with that adage, we have to also be concerned about the impact of our decisions. Yes, intent matters, but impact matters as well. And regardless of where you are, if you are in a space of unaware destruction or conscious destructiveness, there are different solutions to those 2 things. So let's talk first about people who are in the willfully destructive zone. And I meet people all over the country who would say, well, no, that's not me. But to that group of people, I ask, how do you treat young people? Because you see, if I say, these young people today, have you seen them? I can usually find, and I say usually because I'm saying upwards of 90% of the time, someone in the audience who would say, oh my God, yes, have you seen them? If I throw in a word like millennials, even more people will get on the bandwagon to say that there's something uniquely wrong with an entire generation of people. My question is, do you know? And if you do, share with me in the chat how old the oldest millennials will turn this year. How old will the oldest millennials be this year? What age? 40. Thank you, Kaylin. Now, what age are you so old that the federal government protects you against discrimination based on age? My HR people on the line should absolutely know that answer. Oh, Brad, much lower. Sasha, 40. That's correct, 40. So millennials are so old that they are in a class that the federal government deems them to be old enough to need protection by class. However, when we talk about millennials, we still talk about them as if they're 15-year-old kids who have no or very little ability to run their own lives. And, to people who are fellow Christians, I say Jesus only lived to be 33, just saying. Willfully destructive people are consciously biased. And the reason that in the example that I used, I would say that people are consciously biased against youth is because they are okay saying it aloud. When pushed, they have no problem speaking in ways that are discriminatory towards young people. Oftentimes, people who are willfully destructive believe that dominant cultures are, in that example, people who are older are superior to people who are younger. And they support and exclude diverse perspectives, very regularly leaving out younger positions on things, making fun of things that young people do, and regularly engage in shark bites. And so my friends prior to 2020, we would get together every summer and we'd have a really large cookout, and it would be all women. And every year it'd be hot because we live here in the Midwest, and the younger women would wear shorter shorts. And I'm using this example because it's a pretty benign, not intellectually challenging example. And those of us who are over 40 would engage in some very swift gossip. And it would sound something like this. Oh my gosh, I can't believe the length of those shorts. I mean, why don't people demonstrate just a little bit more discretion? And what I find interesting is that for every single generation of women at this cookout, if I had video, I could find footage of them wearing shorts that were a little shorter. Because in the 60s and 70s, shorts pants were called hot pants. And in the 80s and 90s, short pants were called Daisy Dukes. And in the 2000s, they're called booty shorts, and all about the same length. Yesterday, for International Women's Day and for Women's History Month, I highlighted Chaka Khan. And if you're not familiar, she's an R&B singer who has, I think 11 Grammys and has been in the field for 50 years, sharing music with us here in the US and around the globe. And Chaka Khan, I found an image of her in the same stance as Cardi B, wearing almost exactly the same outfit. And yet those people who were celebratory of Chaka Khan in 1978 are the same people who would be disparaging against the Cardi B today. And those things are called shark bites. But to help me illustrate the point, I want you to take a poll with me. So I just want you to guess. There's no right or wrong answers. You're just guessing. And please don't use your Google machines, as my grandmother would say. But I want you to think about around the globe, not just here in the US, but around the globe, how many people die each year from complications related to shark bites? How many people die each year from complications related to shark bites? And the poll is open now and you may vote. And And I've got about 15% of you who voted. If you can't see the poll, feel free, like Dave, to put your number in the chat. I've got about 65% of you voted. Come on, help me get to 80. If you're checking your Instagram, slide back over here real quick and take this poll for me. All right. You all are absolutely correct. Most of you got it right. Less than 10 people die each year from complications related to shark bites. And why do I bring up sharks in a session about diversity and inclusion? Well, I bring up sharks in a session about diversity and inclusion because I would argue that the things that make the media, the things that end up on the evening news because they're so egregious that we're all appalled, those are shark bites. And the thing about shark bites is that when a person or a group gets bitten by a shark, no one says, well, I'm not so sure that that was, that the shark intended to hurt the person. I'm not, that person needs to just get thicker skin. I'm not so sure why we're making such a big deal about this. If we stop talking about these shark bites, maybe they'll go away. Nobody says that about shark bites. By and large, people are like, that is horrible. Let's send some resources to be able to support that person. And therefore, I maintain that shark bites are actually, because they're so infrequent, that they're also less damaging. But these willfully destructive situations, what we need to know is that people who engage in more willfully destructive behavior typically can't be moved by data. I can't emphasize enough that one of the only groups where the people in the dominant group have been in the non-dominant group is age related. The older you get, it doesn't matter. You have been young at some point and you know what it's like to be in a group where older people are not listening to you, and yet it doesn't tend to change anything. Willfully destructive people tend to need personal life altering events in order for them to think differently. For these people, it is empathy that's lacking, not necessarily information. So maybe if when my child is 22 years old and has amazing ideas and who is being not listened to at work and who is very responsible, then in those situations, I might be open to listening. Another example could be if I have no ability challenges and I'm not thinking about accessibility of my buildings and spaces. The moment at which I end up losing a limb and then I'm having trouble navigating, this is often described by people who, for whatever reason, have to use crutches for a small amount of time. They start to then concern themselves with accessibility of spaces in ways that they did not before, because now they have learned to be empathetic. Now they are thinking about how they are in the shoes of another, and so now they care about that issue. But I just want to point out, look at this face. Is this the face of a person you want to trust with building empathy in organizations? I would venture to say no. And so because of that, what we do is work with organizations who already have very well-meaning people, who are already kind, who have certain levels of emotional intelligence. And our job is to just help them to think differently about how they engage in the diversity, equity, and inclusion space. That's where we specialize. In fact, when people call and say, we have someone on our team who is incredibly destructive and we need to turn them around, I actually turn down that work because we are not the best at it. We are the best at working with really nice people who still get it wrong. The people who are stuck in this zone that we call unaware destruction. So these people are the ones who are unconsciously biased, of which all of us are. They already possess certain levels of empathy, have positive intent, lots of it, but they are wildly ignorant and destructive. These people, we say, are masters of the mosquito bite. This is a pesky little mosquito. And I am interested in knowing if you know how many people around the globe actually die from mosquito bites every single year? How many people die from mosquito bites every single year? So if you would please, around the globe, not just here in the US, how many people around the globe die from complications related to mosquito bites? And as my grandmother would say, again, please don't use your Google machines. I've got about 66% of you who voted. Keep coming. All right. And so most of you guessed thousands, but about 40%, almost 40% of you, 39% of you guessed correctly. There are 1 million people each year around the globe who die from complications related to mosquito bites. And why is that important? Because if I were to come to you and I said, you know, a mosquito bit me today, most people would say, I mean, okay, mosquitoes bite me. What's your issue? And the challenge becomes when people are dealing with mosquito bite types of issues that they don't get support, that people tend to be able to explain the issue away. I will use a race example in this particular instance. My son is 22 years old. He attends USC in Southern California. And when he first got accepted, he was very proud of his university and he would wear paraphernalia. And on our first plane trip together out to LA, someone sitting across the row asked him, "Oh, you go to USC? What sport do you play?" Now I clutch my invisible pearls, grab his thigh, and I am just like, oh my gosh. He gently puts his hand on mine and he's basically saying to me, Mom, it's okay. And in fact, after he finished having a conversation with the person, and he was so nice, he said to me, Mom, I look like an athlete. So, of course, people are going to ask that question. And when he says he looks like an athlete, he's talking about his muscular build. He had played football in high school and basketball at the varsity level and was the team captain for both sports. So I'm like, okay, I'll let it go. You know, I know what it's like to get bitten by millions of mosquito bites. You haven't gotten there yet. But this year's his senior year. And now when he wears USC paraphernalia and someone says to him, what sport do you play? He now has adopted some of how I feel or how I felt the first time he heard it. And here's why. After about the 200th time someone asked him what sport did he play, he said to his friend Jake, who happens to be white, who also is an athlete. He plays tennis, so he also has a very athletic build. He said, Jake, what question do people ask you when they find out you go to USC? Jake thought the question was very strange. And he was like, of course they ask me what's my major. Because what is your major is the most appropriate question to ask a college student unless you have internal biases that somehow believe that Black people who go to USC must be there because they are on an athletic scholarship, not because they have a 33 on their ACT and because they're majoring in economics and math. And so these types of mosquito bites, these little things by themselves are not that damaging. However, when you add them up, you have to understand that stress is cumulative. So while we concern ourselves with the major shark bites of the world, I maintain that it's actually the mosquito bites that are the most damaging. It's the small things that over and over and over again cause stress and are cumulative and reinforce in people's minds prejudice and bias. People who are sitting in the unaware destruction zone, for them, information is what's most powerful. And the opportunities actually lie in the small things. And so my hope is that we can shift our mindsets about how we view the small things and instead redirect our focus from our reactions related to the bigger things in the world. Not that shark bites are not important, but it's the everyday bias that shows up that we want to look away from, that we want to write off as political correctness, that is actually where our opportunities lie. So how do you raise awareness in for people who are very well-meaning, however, are destructive in their behaviors? The first thing is it's absolutely necessary to keep shame low. The second thing is I am not advocating for us to start slow or to be patient with people. What I am advocating for is that we have to start with pre-algebra and then algebra and then progress to calculus, that there are foundational ideas that people have to have first before we can embark on some of the more complicated topics that tend to be emotionally charged and intellectually challenging for people. And then there are three specific dimensions that I will share with you today for how, if you take on this work on your own, three dimensions that I need you to be thinking about with your team or with larger groups. So keeping shame low, this idea comes from the work of Brene Brown. Many people are very well aware of what she teaches. But there's an exercise that is very common in the diversity and inclusion space where you pull the entire team together and you ask people as a group to step up if they have had certain advantages in their lives and to step back if they've had certain disadvantages in their lives. Questions range from, did you get the newspaper in your home? Did you have both parents available? Could you pay your bills or not? What was your school like? And at the end of all of the questioning, there's a dispersion of people around the room. And I maintain that the people with the most advantages at the front of the room tend to feel guilt and shame, but also the people at the back of the room also feel shame and worse, traumatized. I don't believe that people have to be traumatized in order to learn. And what we do know is that ashamed adults are not learning adults. And so that same exercise could be conducted as pre-work. And here's what I mean. If we allow people to think about not how they're bad people, but maybe instead how they've done things that were destructive, we would then be able to think about ways that we can conduct guilt-inducing content in private. So using that example, you would have the people on your team or in groups watch a video of other people in the privacy of their own homes stepping up based on advantages they have or stepping back based on disadvantages they had. And then when you brought people together in a group, they would just have discussions about what they learned from observing other people engaged in that activity. Doing it this way, again, keeps shame low, which then improves learning, which is what we're going after. The goal is not to shame or guilt people, it is to improve their learning. It also heightens collaboration and innovation on teams and is evidence-based and proven to reduce workplace bullying rather than causing it to go up. And so I invite you, as you think about exercises that you see that you're like, oh my gosh, I learned a lot from that. How can you help other people learn the same thing, but provide opportunities for them to be able to process their own lived experiences in private? How can you allow people to process their own lived experiences in private? Again, the goal is to keep shame low so that learning will be high. Now, about those three dimensions I talked about, the first is the personal dimension, and that's where our internal prejudices lie, and we will talk more about that. The second is after I move from what's going on in my heads. So the people who think, well, why don't we just do X? Or things would be better if we would just treat people more kindly, happens very often. That falls in the interpersonal dimension about our behaviors. And I would argue that if we don't address what's going on in the head, the interpersonal dimensions are almost impossible to address. The dimension that many times people ignore or forget to think about is the institution, which are the practices, the laws, the policies, the procedures that reinforce all of these. And it is not just one, it is all three. The things we think, the things we do, and then how that progresses into institutional work that we do. So if we're thinking about our personal prejudices, I didn't on my own just learn the adage, a woman's place is in the, finish the statement based on what you've heard in your life, not what you believe. A woman's place is in the kitchen. What else might people say? Home. Thank you, Nikki and Kay, Scott, Ryan. Thank you all. So we don't believe that, but we have heard that. And so often when people do engage in taking implicit association tests, what they learn is that even though they don't necessarily consciously believe that a woman's place is in the home or in the kitchen, there are internal thoughts and beliefs that are unconscious, that are just rolling around in there, that came to us from our parents, or if we didn't have parents, if we were raised by grandparents or in the foster care system, that we just learned over time, that are just rolling around in our heads. And so if we're angry, if we're lonely, if we're tired, hungry, hurt, our first decision will sometimes be driven by these things that are just going on in our heads. Every single person on the planet has prejudices. If you tell me that you don't, then in some ways, what you're telling me is you've never heard a song, you've never been exposed to religion, nobody reared you, you haven't watched any billboards or TVs or listened to any radio stations. And I would also argue that if that were the case, then you have different prejudices based on the fact that you haven't been exposed to these things. But all of us have prejudices in the personal dimension. But what does that look like when we're working on the personal dimension? It's self-work that only we can do. Nobody else can help us with it. And that's why it's difficult to master. It is incredibly hard to say, I want to learn what my unconscious biases are. And so therefore, I am going to seek out ways for people to help me see the things that I am not seeing. And I want to be able to do so in a non-threatening way. People's tone has to be the right way when they tell me about it. And I don't want it to happen in public. And I don't want to lose anything as a result of learning about my personal biases. And that's why this one is the hardest to master. But when those things come out of our heads and they move into how do we interact with other people, that's where the term discrimination lies. And so those are the external behaviors and actions that are both positive and negative that show up in the way that we treat other people. And so what does that look like? It shows up in the types of people we favor, as well as the types of people that we exclude. It shows up in terms of what we value and don't value, what we promote, and, also what we decide is not worth promoting. So when I think about personality as a form of difference, no teacher on the planet who is worth his or her weight in gold would tell a child to be discriminatory based on communication style. They would never say, the introverted child is someone that we need to exclude. However, there are many ways in which teachers teach us to exclude based on introversion. How does it look? The kiddos who raise their hands, we think that they always have the answers, and the ones who don't raise their hands, we assume they don't know the answer. We call children who tend to need more reflection time and who prefer to work alone or who prefer smaller groups of friends, we call them shy. We say that they lack energy or passion. And so as we get older, having been exposed to those things, then we, if we're not careful, will include in our job descriptions, let's say for a sales position, words like, we need someone who is driven, collaborative, a team player. And what we mean is that we expect them to show up in extroverted ways. What are the challenges with that? Only 50% of the people in the world have preferences for extroversion. And so if you end up hiring all extroverted salespeople, there's an entire group of people that you will not be able to connect with because they want a salesperson who is going to be more authentic with them on a personal level, who gives them opportunities to reflect, who is not talking over them, who's listening, who, when they talk, they are being very genuine about what they say. And while extroverts can do that, introverts tend to be much better at it. And so that's how these internal prejudices that our well-meaning teachers put into our heads show up in the ways we discriminate. And then we look up one day and we have entire sales teams that the group has decided was outgoing, that the group has decided are acceptable types of people for sales positions. And while everyone is prejudiced in some way, we have internal beliefs in our heads. And while everyone prefers certain things and other things not so much, we don't all necessarily have the institutional power. So, what's the institutional dimension? When I now reinforce in my succession planning, who gets to be a CEO, who gets to be progressed into the, what do we call them, the not the succession, the high performance groups, those people who we give more training to, we put them in special programs so that they can learn how to lead us all to some kind of proverbial promised land. What we then do is reinforce this idea and this belief that there are certain people, again, who are better than others, and that there's this talented group of people who are going to save us from ourselves. How do we know that things have been reinforced and from the institutional or systemic level? We can typically see it by disparity. So if we're using gender as an example, if I work for an organization and at the lower ranks of, let's say, a school district, most of the teachers are women. But when you start to look at principals and superintendents, then they tend to be men. Stop trying to justify that and realize that there's something in the norms, policies, procedures, and laws and how schools are formed that is causing that disparity. And typically the rules reinforce this type of separation. They don't really typically help. So again, it's internal prejudice, of which everyone is, plus external discrimination, of which everyone has the ability to do. But the institutional is reinforced by power and control. There is support for the ways that I show up, and not everyone has institutional power. And so sometimes when we're talking about underrepresented groups, we'll say, well, extroverts get discriminated against. My teacher didn't call on me because, and I got sent to the principal's office a lot for talking too much. Okay, yes, extroverts can be discriminated against, but if we look at the rule rather than the exception, extroversion is reinforced by power and control. People who can express their ideas swiftly without any reflection time, people who have large groups of friends regardless of the breadth and depth of those relationships, the people who, if they're asked a question on the dime, can respond, are the ones we have been trained to believe are better leaders, although there's no evidence of such. And so everyone does not have institutional power and control, and we need to make sure that where we have power, we are using it appropriately. My last request to you is that wherever you are, whether that's on the willfully destructive spectrum or on the unconsciously destructive zone, just start somewhere. This is a big challenge. And many times people will say, oh my gosh, this is so big, I don't know what to do. But Jeff Bezos started Amazon in a garage. Today, he's worth almost $200 billion, and we don't know how to run our lives without Amazon. We know how to do hard things. And so start where you are, use what you have, and do what you can. The question people tend to have for us is like, okay, Nicole, well, what are you doing? Well, imperfectly, I am trying to get more of this information in front of more people more often. Um, if by chance you want more, you can find out about much of this content through the Lively Paradox virtual training program. And I also have written a book called that Kevin referenced, called Lively Paradox: An Authentic Perspective on Issues of Diversity and Inclusion. It comes with, I have written out an entire Train the Trainer, and I think it's $3 for the Train the Trainer, and the book is like $12. So for $15, you can teach your own internal classes about diversity and inclusion before you progress to any content around racial equity. So that is what I have for you today. I hope that there are plenty of questions for me to answer. And Kevin, I think you said that you were going to help me with those questions.
I'm going to do my best.
Okay.
Am I coming through here now? Okay, so let's see. We've got a couple. Deanna said, let me get these up here. I think Jonathan Jones had a question. Just got to turn on the right thing. All panelists and attendees, the questions. You know, oh, there's my bar. I couldn't see the Q&A bar. Now, Deanna was telling me, Deanna, you may have to chime in here too. You said Jonathan had a question, but I am not seeing that on my screen at this point. Here we go. 3 new messages. Here's a couple. Oh, okay. Here it is. It's in the chat bar. Do you have any recommended reading for anyone who wants to better inform themselves? Your book obviously is a good one. Any other thoughts?
I do. In fact, I have a long list, and I will share it with you, Kevin, if you can send it out to.
We will. Yeah.
Yeah, it's I've got it broken out by topic. So some of them are about race, some of them are about religion, others are just about difference. I maintain that my book is not about, it's not a race book, it's a book about difference. And they're the books that I feel I've learned the most about this topic reading. So I will share that with you. Thank you for your question, Jonathan.
That'd be great. Thank you. Let's see here. Again, a lot of people saying this was awesome. And then we also had a question from Pedro about, will the recording be shared? Yes, all the participants will be receiving a link to a YouTube video of this. Just depends on how quickly we can get this processed and posted out there. So we will have it out there. You know, Dr. Price, I think that, you know, the last presentation I saw you give was a little different than this one. So you have quite a variety of different topics you can speak on. And I just think the whole thing and the whole topic you spoke of about these kind of learned biases and prejudices, just fascinating to think about. And I think that so many of us would be surprised at the things that happened in our childhood that may have affected us more than we realize. Would you have any specific examples you could give of just some real subtle little learned prejudices that we don't really even think about, beyond maybe the one about your son in USC, you know, because I never have that question, I'll be quite honest, about being athletic and playing sports, because there's never any question that I was, as a matter of fact, they go, you played basketball? I go, yeah, I sat on the bench most of the time. So, but any other little examples that might be some learned prejudices that you could share with us?
Yeah, I will. I'll share one if I might just be vulnerable here with the group for a minute that I was just made aware of last week or maybe 2 weeks ago. So when people have ability challenges, we are taught, not told, that they need to be fixed. So if I can't see, then I need to get LASIK. If I can't hear, I need to get tubes to make it so that I can hear. If we try to get people to have children younger so that they reduce their risk of having a child with Down syndrome. And I met someone who said to me, what if who you inherently were, the world was trying to engineer you out of the program? Meaning that they don't believe that there's anything of value to be learned from a blind person or a person with Down syndrome. And I think one thing that is different about me than most people I'm trying to help, and I'm not saying this to brag at all. I'm saying this because of 20 years worth of work. You do change. Is that when I know I have privilege or advantage, I really try to listen and try to see the other person's point of view rather than trying to discount it, or rather than trying to find someone who might be blind, who disagrees. And so in that same week, there was a young woman who had a visual impairment, and I don't know exactly what it was, but I was using the word blind spot to mean unaware. And she said to me, Nicole, that's ableist language, and it's incredibly hurtful to suggest that blind means ignorant. And I was like, but Harvard uses the word blind spot. When you look it up in the dictionary, the word blind spot means to be unaware. I don't mean it. But that is just an example of how, when you're in the dominant group, the institution of laws, practices, and policies support your position. And so you might notice there were a couple times when I was stumbling a little bit around my words because I had been used to saying the word blind spot, but I've now scrubbed it from my language to try to be, again, try not to engage in mosquito bites. So that's an example of how, for me, that even I have to be careful.
That's a great example. Speaking of mosquito bites, we had a question about shark bites. And what do you, for those who are experiencing those possibly in their workplace, whether it be, any number of different reasons, how do you suggest that they handle those things?
Yeah, so I wrote another little book, and it's a little book. It's small. It's like 50 pages or so, called Cultivating Culture as a Garden. And I invite people to think about where in the gardening stage is their workplace. And I'm going to get to the point here, but if you're going into an organization with people who have lots of places where they're unaware, where you are the only one representing a community or a group, you need to know that you're going into a tilling phase, which means that the ground is going to be hard and people are not going to be open and receptive, that you're there to make things better for people coming after you, maybe. And if that's where your organization is, you need to know that, and you need to decide if you have the stamina to be a tiller. And some people disagree with me on that, but I'll just say this. It is much easier if you are not a tiller, if you're a planter, to go work at a place that is ready for what you're bringing, than it is to try to change a system from the inside out. Now, tillers, again, have the thick skin they're typically the first in any kind of organization. So if an engineering team decides they're going to hire creatives, for example, the very first creatives are really going to struggle because human condition is to leave people out. But after folks start to see the outcomes of working with various differences, then what happens is over time they go, oh yeah, we need creatives. And then you can have more planters, people who are just there to kind of build on each other's ideas. But when you just have tillers and planters, what happens, Ryan, is any good gardener knows that weeds will take over your garden. You can't just till and plant. You have to have people who are weed pullers, who will go deep and push people to go further than they ever even imagine. In some ways, people think I'm a weed puller. I swear that I'm not. But what happens in many organizations once they're sparked into awareness is they go, send me a weed puller. Yeah, I want somebody who is going to help me go deep and far and fix this thing. When a weed puller is on staff at the tilling stage, I have never seen it go well. So my first suggestion to you would be to evaluate the lay of the land of your organization. Where are they? Is it the organization, or are you just in a specific spot whereby the leader or the people on your team happen to engage in shark bites? If you're just in a spot, I would say reach out to use sponsorships. I'm not the person to tell you to go to HR, because typically HR people, don't kill me, but typically HR is there to support the company, not the employee. So
Yeah,
I mean, that
true.
I've worked in HR.
Who's writing their paycheck, right?
Yes.
Now here's a question that I'm trying to think how to phrase this. You know, in our annual meeting this year, we had a great panel that kind of opened up the discussion on this topic on diversity, equity, inclusion. And one of the things that John Meinke from Sporting KC brought up is he said, you know, Kevin, everyone on your panel is brown in some way, shape, or form. And he said, you know, people need to see people that look like them talking about these messages. And this question that we got was that a lot of times the people talking about this are just people of color. How do we change that so it's not just people of color talking about it? How can people get, you know, kind of empowered so that they feel comfortable going out and talking about some of these topics?
Well, first, I want everyone on the line to know that I love you all with my whole heart. So what I'm about to say, I hope you take it in that in that in that regard. The ability to be an ist, and you can be an ableist, a racist, whatever, is actually quite easy. Doing nothing is the easiest way to keep these systems in place. And so when I'm in a dominant group, it requires me to take action, but you're going to lose something. This idea that I'm going to take action and it's not going to require anything of me, it just does not exist. And so when you get to see the examples of that, Dr. Robin DiAngelo, for example, a Jewish, white, wealthy woman who's decided to speak out about white fragility, she is being attacked at all over the place. And so I'm just honoring that is why when you're in dominant groups, people won't take the necessary risk. An example, this week I was yesterday was taking up for transgender girls, and my goodness, women have been furious with me about transgender girls competing in sports, and what does that look like? And my question is very simple. Well, if they don't belong with the girls, and if they don't belong with the boys, we're saying they don't belong anywhere. And
Yeah.
if you are a well-meaning person, you can't, that just can't be it. And so I've got two suggestions. The first one is recognize that doing so is going to come at personal risk. You cannot decide to take action and it's not going to cost you anything. It is going to cost you something. The second thing is to just do it, educate yourself, and then own that you're going to speak up and speak out. There's a beautiful example in a podcast related to race, and it's called Seeing White. In fact, let me type it to everyone. Seeing White. I recommend it. I listened to it even though it was not created for me, because it is a beautiful example of how we can show up as better allies and advocates.
Great.
And I'm following their example.
Good recommendation. Well, thank you so much for joining us today in this, you know, giving us, we're just about to the end of our close time, and I just really appreciate it. We're going to be sharing a link to this video with all the participants after the event. Again, within the next 24 hours, I think there'll be a few links we'll be including in that I think you guys will find very valuable. And Dr. Price, I just want to thank you, and I want to thank our presenting sponsor, CrossFirst Bank, and also our supporting sponsor, the Barstow School, for your support of this very important work. And stay tuned as we work together to help us become a better community and keep building a greater Leawood and Leawood Chamber and greater world. So thank you very much, Dr. Price, for joining us today.